At the end of the first week, I made a point to eat with her during break in the cafeteria. I'd seen her talking to the emergency workers from time to time, but as far as I knew, she hadn't talked to anyone else. I was concerned that she'd internalized too much, everything the workers brought back from the pile. I asked if the seat was taken, and she just gave me this vacant look, and then she looked down at the empty chair, and she looked back at me and just shook her head. No, the chair wasn't taken. I set down my tray of spaghetti and garlic bread and asked her how she was holding up. She waited, seeming to think about it while she twisted noodles onto her fork. I remember she had this really dry monotone when she first talked to me. She said, "One of these guys found a man's torso today." I wasn't expecting her to talk about somebody else, but I remember that being the first thing she said to me. She said, "Another body part was embedded into the chest. The cop who found it assumed it was the man's own hand, but after he looked closer at the wedding ring on the finger, he realized it was a woman's hand." She looked at me for a while before taking another bite of pasta, but I don't think she was looking for a reaction. The tone of her voice had never changed, so I wasn't sure if that was her answer to my question or if I should ask again, maybe in a different way. But in that same tone, she said, "Another one of these guys keeps finding kids' shoes, just empty shoes." And she said, "I've never had a stranger fall into my arms like that. He tried really hard to not cry. I cried, but he kept saying, 'Nobody's seen me cry in 40 years. I can't cry.'" And she said, I told him to cry. I said, "Please cry. It's okay." But he was afraid that if he let himself break down, that there was something wrong with him, that he was nuts or something. And so he just kept holding it in, and it made him hiccup, and his neck jerked around in this really sad way, but he really didn't want to cry. She didn't say nothing for a while, and I thought she was staring through me when she finally said, "So I could be worse." I let that settle for a second before I asked her if she'd ever volunteered for something like this. She said, "Has anybody?" I meant for a disaster in general. She said, "I've never done anything like this in my entire life. This is the first time I've ever done something I've so fully misunderstood, probably ever." So I asked what she normally did, but she just said, "I'm a volunteer here." I started to say I meant, but she stopped me and said, "This is what's normal right now." I watched her twist more spaghetti onto her fork. I didn't know how to respond. I needed to listen, like we did for all the emergency workers. After she swallowed, I I realized that I stared at her. I hadn't meant to stare. I didn't want to offend her in some way, and then she said, "I'm sorry." And she shook her head a little, maybe at herself, and she said, "This is all just so strange, and I haven't really talked to anyone all week. I've mostly just listened." She stopped for a moment and looked down at her plate, and then she told me what she did before she volunteered. "If you really want to know, I just make videos for rich people." She said that to her plate while spinning her fork into more noodles. She mumbled, "I just make videos for rich people. Nothing important." I asked if she meant she did something like ads, advertising. She looked up at me and said, "Something like that." She took another bite of bread, and I assumed that was the gist of it. She didn't say otherwise anyhow, and didn't seem interested in saying nothing more about what she did. But I wanted to hear a little bit about her story, so I said, "A lot of New Yorkers tell me they feel a real need to be here. Maybe like it's family, even if you didn't know anyone who worked here." She swallowed her food and drank from her water bottle, and she shook off a little bit of that monotone and said, I've lived in New York since 1983, so I guess that's already 18 years now, half of my life. When I first moved here, I came from Iowa. I grew up in Iowa City, and I always knew where I was in Iowa City. In New York, though, by myself, 18 years old, I suddenly had to figure out a lot of things on my own for the first time. I'd get out of a subway station and I had no idea which direction I was going in. I didn't know if I was walking north or south, or if I'd somehow gotten off in New Jersey by mistake. I didn't know what the hell I was doing in those first few days and weeks, but I realized that at least in lower Manhattan, if I saw the World Trade Center, I knew that was south, and so I got my bearings after a few months, but I never really let go of that idea. So every time I saw those buildings, I thought of them as being my compass needle, and I could get where I was going because of those buildings. And even if that wasn't true half the time, it always felt that way. So it became true after a while. It became a part of my truth, whatever that might be. Those buildings might have been ugly, but they became a truth for a lot of us.